Hey there, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me. I want to make sure that my mic is working. So if someone can give me something in the chat session that says that my mic is working, I would completely appreciate that. Let me go into the chat room here. I don't hear either. It's working. Okay, my mic is working. Okay, I hear you. Excellent. Thank you guys for letting me know that my mic is working properly. So I am your host for the evening. My name is Gigi Mormon. I'm a local entrepreneur here in Orlando, and I am a broker for iConnect Real Estate, as well as the chief connector for Raise Your Glass Promotions. But more importantly, I am a member of the board of directors for Hannibal Square Community Land Trust, and I am excited to welcome you all to our conversation, our Juneteenth 2020 event, where I believe that you're going to walk away with a lot of education, with new perspective, historical, and things that are taking place in today's day and time, because our two speakers are just amazing. Dr. Julian Chambliss is currently a professor of English with an appointment in history, and he's the Van Berryman Curator of History at Michigan State University. Dr. Scott French is a digital public historian specializing in the study of cultural landscapes and sites of memory associated with 19th and 20th century African American and Southern history. Both have authored papers and books, and the knowledge and the wisdom that they're going to share with us today is crucial for today's era and the challenges that are taking place. So I'm really excited to hear from both of them. When I asked Julian to tell me what it was that made him want to be a part of this conversation, his response was that it reminds him of the importance of the Black political imagination. And I've heard him speak many times. So I can definitely tell you that that is true of Julian. When I spoke to Scott, I'll tell you what he said. Little technology issues here, but we're going to get it all together. Scott's answer to why he was interested was so interesting to me, because I haven't met Scott yet. And so I took particular interest in his reason why he was inspired. So he said, this Juneteenth, I'm inspired by the idea of 4 million newly emancipated Black people defining the meaning of freedom. First, through their pooled efforts to purchase land in places like Central Florida in the 1870s and 1880s, and second, through communal acts of placemaking that survive to this day. For takeaways, one of the things that he's hoping is that people will consider the moral, political, and economic enterprise that connects the 19th century founders of historic Black towns and settlements like Eatonville and Hannibal Square to the work of Hannibal Square Community Land Trust and other nonprofit advocates of permanent, affordable, quality housing today. And for those of you that are just getting to know Hannibal Square Community Land Trust or don't know much about us, it is a nonprofit organization that is whose mission is to make sure that we create permanent affordable housing. So permanent affordable housing creates economic stability, and it creates a deeper sense of community. One of our first projects was in Canton, and you're seeing a picture of some of the homes that were built there. So Hannibal Square Community Land Trust started in 2004 by building 10 homes. And it came about because residents were concerned about gentrification in their area, and they wanted to make sure that home ownership was preserved for generations to come. In 2007, they built an additional 4 homes on Comstock, and then in 2013, they built 5 more homes. In 2015, you can see that we partnered with the Veterans Administration, and we built a home for a combat disabled veteran through unity, through community engagement. We wanted to make sure that a veteran could have a home because they served our country, and now it was time for us to serve them. So in terms of community involvement, we are always making sure that the Land Trust is focused on taking care of community members. Affordable housing, it's economic stability, and in Central Florida, we are in a dire situation when it comes to affordable housing. So organizations like the Community Land Trust are so necessary because we want to help people by giving them the opportunity to build wealth through equity. And the way that we do that is through our ground lease agreements. So when the buyer purchases their home, the trust actually keeps the land. And by doing that, we're able to create permanent affordable housing because when the next person buys the house, it's not going to be at market rate, which would push out the majority of people that are looking for affordable housing. So those are the three main things that we do. Currently, we renovated a home in the West Lakes Partnership area that is under contract for the new home buyers to move in, hopefully by next month. And in addition, we're working on building 30 townhomes and 28 apartments over on the Orange Central Boulevard, which is the Camping World Stadium area. And in addition to building those homes, we're also going to create commercial real estate space. So 15,000 square feet of retail space, hopefully, that allows entrepreneurs to have access to commercial space that they couldn't have access to before. And our true hope is that it'll be a lot of the people from the community over in the West Lakes Partnership area that will be able to open a business underneath the homes that we are creating for affordable housing. In addition to that project, we're also going to build townhomes, 24 townhomes in the Apopka area. So we do already have that piece of land, and we hope to have both of these projects up and running between the end of this year and early next year, because again, we need to address the issue of permanent affordable housing, and this is the only way we can do it. So Hannibal Square Community Land Trust is doing their part to make sure that our community can be, more people in our community can become homeowners than there have been in the past. We definitely want to say a special thank you to our corporate partner, City National Bank, for financing or for presenting this event tonight. And we hope that you will look into their bank and see if they could be a possible banking partner for you. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Julian Chambliss and Dr. Scott Frank to start the conversation. I'll throw in one thing first is that we are giving giveaways during the event. And the first giveaway was from people that RSVP'd for the event. And we have a winner for that. And her name is Africa Henley. So Miss Henley, congratulations. You win a $50 Uber Eats gift card. And we have your email address. So we'll make sure that we send that out to you and we contact you tomorrow. So Julian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Gigi. I'm happy to join you for this live stream on this Juneteenth. Of course, with things that have happened out in the world in the last few months, it seems that Juneteenth has taken on a new meaning. And I'm really, it's always a pleasure to be with my colleague, Scott French, to have a little discussion about Juneteenth, about the Black political imagination, as Gigi said when she asked what I think is important about this. Well, to me, it's about the Black political imagination. But that really manifests in Central Florida, in the communities and the long, complex history of the region. I moved on to a different job, but of course, I spent many years there and grew up in Florida. And so it's always great to engage again with my friends and colleagues still there. So Scott, how would you like to introduce yourself in this endeavor?
Oh, I think enough's been said about me. I'm going to say a few words about Juneteenth. It's really great to be here to celebrate. I've been reading a lot about Juneteenth. This year, more than any year, it's been in the news, and I've been getting asked a lot about it. So I think everybody by now knows that Juneteenth is the nationwide holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. And most people know that Juneteenth refers to June 19th, 1865, which is the day that Union General Gordon Granger issued general orders to the people of Texas that, quote, all slaves are free. And the big question, of course, is why wasn't the Civil War over by June 1865? Hadn't Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox back in April? And that is true, but the war wasn't over. In Texas, there were still 60,000 Confederate troops under the command of General Edmund Kirby Smith, who is somewhat notorious of late in Florida because his statue for many years represented Florida in the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol. And now there's a big controversy about where it's going. And so Smith held out. He refused to surrender. It wasn't until his troops started deserting that he finally surrendered on June 2nd, 1865. And then 2 weeks later, Granger issued his order. And so the celebrations that mark that event have become an annual tradition. And it began in Texas and has spread across the United States. And interestingly, one other thing that Julian and I were talking about earlier was that it was not always Emancipation Day, which is another way of celebrating this, was celebrated on different dates in different parts of the country. So in Virginia, they celebrated April 3rd, and that had to do with the marching of the troops into Richmond, the Union troops into Richmond. Here in Central Florida, I found an article from Eatonville in 1916 that the Hungerford School was celebrating Emancipation Day on January 1st, which is the date of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. But I think all of these speak to the importance of the date. And so then I'm going to turn it back over to Julian, and let's sort of figure out what next. We have emancipation, and now we're going to talk about community building and placemaking.
Right, and I think that introduction to Juneteenth as a historical event really sort of points to one of the primary concerns that I think both have as scholars who've thought about the Southern experience and thought in particular about Florida and the African-American experience there, is that usually when we tell these histories of these pivotal moments, it's from the white perspective, right? And so this sort of focus on Abraham Lincoln, as we can sort of see when we think about the major dates and the way it's shown and taught in high school and taught to people, what they remember is basically a kind of white narrative of Black people being free. And this great image from Harper's Weekly, you know, this is a classic image, you know, Abraham Lincoln's at the bottom of the picture. You have this sort of story of African Americans, and he's the man who set them free. And the sort of political agency of African Americans before slavery's end, championing it and working against it as anti-slavery advocates, the work of people like Frederick Douglass writing their narratives of their story, making it clear the sort of evil associated with slavery, the more radical voices like a David Walker with his appeal, all these things get sort of skirted aside in terms of this narrative. And at some level, when we think about Juneteenth, the centrality of Black people in that narrative becomes something I think is really important. And as you point out, the politics of Black people's experience, of course, is in some ways fractured by the reality of what it means to acquire and be citizens in the public sphere. So as Scott pointed out, the actual general order that frees the slaves is given out by the military. And of course, it's important to sort of think about this sort of background story as one of, in the aftermath of the war, this huge question about the status of African Americans, right? Are African Americans American citizens with all the rights and privileges associated with that, or do they still deal with the weight of a sort of racist society that said they will never be equal? So when we start thinking about this in the context of Juneteenth, this discussion of it as a holiday, what are African Americans discussing? Celebrating? What are they talking about? I think they're talking about a kind of collectivism around not just simply what's on the books. When we think about the amendments that ensure African American freedom after the Civil War, and some of the recent work and sort of television specials by William Gates, when he had his Reconstruction special, he talked about the politics of getting the 13th, and 14th, and 15th Amendment passed and what that represented. That's a politics of Republicans, white Republicans, African Americans sort of working together. And in the Florida story, we often talk about this, Scott and I, in our conversation about the region, as being one that offers up some important sort of insights into that broader narrative. And so the question is, what is that collective vision of community, not simply in the context of Central Florida, which I think is evocative of a kind of political vision being articulated by African Americans in this period, but also broadly about African Americans in a post Civil War South, right? And of course, one way to think about this is, of course, that Central Florida is a land of opportunity. Florida is a land of opportunity that draws a number of African Americans to the space. And I think no place better typifies the complexity of that than Central Florida. And there's two stories that Scott and I often sort of use to sort of like tease out this complexity. And one is that story of Maitland and Eatonville, and the other, of course, is the story of Hannibal Square and Winter Park. And Scott, what would you like to say about that Maitland Eatonville story?
Well, I think what we see here is really the Black political imagination coming together with a white political imagination, and it's not a native white Southern imagination. It's a radical Republican abolitionist imagination. And so in this area, because it's frontier, it's not a plantation culture, it's open, and you have a unique opportunity to create something new. And so our research looks at this founding era. The impetus for all of this is coming from African Americans. Joe Clark, who's pictured in the top of the slide here, Joe Clark and two other men traveled to Central Florida in 1875 to 1877 to create a colony. They call it a colony. And no white people from the North or the South will sell them land in this area. And it isn't until the man on the left, Lewis Lawrence, settles in this area in Maitland, that they begin to form an alliance. And it is very much a political alliance. Lawrence was a radical Republican, very disappointed in the party for abandoning blacks in the South. And he was also troubled by the fact that the citrus workers, the black citrus grove workers who worked on his winter property and worked with him, they had no homes of their own, no church, no place to live. And so he worked closely with Joe Clark to create a possibility for a black neighborhood within the town of Maitland, within this unincorporated town of Maitland. And that's sort of an untold story in the history of Eatonville. It's the backstory. It isn't hidden. It's Joe Clark tells this story in the only surviving issue of the Eatonville Speaker. He talks about Lewis Clark as a whole-souled philanthropist who made it possible for Eatonville to exist. But again, it would not have existed without, it was really a dream and a vision of Joe Clark and the other men who tried to form a colony here. And I think what this speaks to is this alliance. And Julian, do you want to talk a bit about Hannibal Square?
Right, in a similar sense that you have a kind of founding figure like Joe Clark and him working with African Americans in Maitland to help create Eatonville. In the Hannibal Square case, there's Lauren Chase and Oliver Chapman, two Northerners who come down, businessmen, both in some level drawn by the opportunity. Health concerns draw Chase. They see this land, they lay out, they plan Winter Park. And of course, Chase is a good friend with Lawrence, and their relationship, I think, influences a little bit about how Chase is approaching his work here too. In a similar way, there's a pivotal figure, a man named Gus Henderson, who's a printer who will help go on and found the African-American newspaper, the Winter Park Advocate, who works in tandem to help Chase realize the dream of Winter Park being incorporated. If it wasn't for African Americans, of course, as more registered voters at the time of the incorporation push, then the white counterparts, Winter Park would not have been incorporated as a town. And as a consequence, of course, there were two African American aldermen at the founding of Winter Park and served well and were a huge part of the sort of founding story. When we start talking about this in terms of that concept of the political imagination, Scott alluded to this idea that there's a story about community and a story about sort of Republican politics that played itself out in the relationships that are created by these sort of biracial political coalitions in these two places. And I do think that that's really important. And telling the story of Hannibal Square or Winter Park as a place where Black people and white people can work together towards creating an equitable and successful community in the vision that's sort of like the post-Reconstruction Republican vision of the South is a crucial part of the narrative that you find in the Winter Park Advocate. In a similar way, but somewhat a little bit different, I think, though, as Scott alluded to, the Eatonville speaker tells a story of Black people and autonomy. And often when we talk about these two places, what you see is these different visions of the Black political imagination playing themselves out. So there's coalitions on both sides, but one leads to a kind of interracial community, while the other leads to the formation of the first incorporated Black municipality in the United States. And that difference is a subtle one, but I think it's an important one because it points to ways that the politics of identity and the politics of success are very important. But I want Scott to talk a little bit about this narrative of Eatonville and what it stands for in terms of this vision of African Americans being articulated by some Republicans in the South.
Well, when I first began to explore the history of the backstory of the white patrons, because we wanted to know what is their motive, and how can you ascribe a kind of benevolent purpose, or maybe it's not benevolent, it's more about self-interest. As I mentioned, this is about politics. These are Northern white radical Republicans who want to build the Republican Party in the South, and they need African Americans as allies. These are not permanent residents of the South. They're snowbirds. They come down and they're here during the winter and they leave during the summer months. And what they want to do is build up the Republican Party by supporting citizenship, full voting rights for African Americans. And I know that Lawrence is very clear about his motive, and others who are offering testimonials say this as well. But I also found a great quote from Loring Chase in Hannibal, who was key to the founding of Winter Park in Hannibal Square. And the quote is, and he points to the presence of the two African-American aldermen on the city council, two intelligent, industrious colored citizens in aldermanic chairs, indicates the manner in which the people of this community, Winter Park, propose to settle the great race problem. The motto is, let justice be done though the heavens fall, remembering that the more justice is done, the less likely the heavens will be to fall. And so they saw this as, from a white perspective, as a model for race relations and class relations too.
And when we think about the narrative coming from Florida, and in some ways, we often try to think about Florida as hyper isolated. Part of the reason that Northern Florida, closer in sort of look and feel to sort of plantation style, where Central Florida, the difficulties of getting here, it is a different place. The narrative coming here, Scott, coming from here out to the rest of the world, rest of the country, is, as Scott alluded to, people like Chase, people like Lawrence are talking about, this is the model, this is the possibility of what a kind of future politic might be, right? That Black and white people can work in tandem. And you see stories like this, a model Negro town in Florida for the New York Times in 1892, speaking to that idea. And of course, it's important to think about, this is a space that also factors into how African Americans are envisioning themselves. Eatonville is a model of a successful African American town that even Booker T. Washington, the sort of most famous African American in the country, and really the most famous African American probably around the world, sort of pointed to Eatonville and pointed to it as an example of the kind of self-sustaining communities that he wanted for African Americans, that as he envisioned African Americans navigating that from that space of agricultural life on the land to able to be more vocal, more active in the public political sphere. This was an important stage, this stage of community. And when you look at his descriptions of Eatonville, he writes about it and takes pictures of it. in one of his famous books, The Negro in Business. Right? And these images really capture a realization of that dream of Eatonville as a place where African Americans be autonomous and successful. And there's always, of course, this picture of the town councilman, the town council around the jail. And in most stories, this is a jail that's never used because there, right, of course, is no crime in Eatonville. And this, of course, is a great picture of the residents of the mayor of Eatonville. These pictures and the vision that informed the creation of both Eatonville and Winter Park, right? Like, they represent a kind of a political imagination of a particular moment, that a collectivism that stretched across racial lines, but was aligned in from a kind of political ideology, could successfully answer the question of what will come of the United States with the defeat of slavery. And that vision, of course, is an important one, and it still resonates, I think, in how people in Central Florida see their spaces and understand their places, but also resonates with, I think, this emphasis on Juneteenth, because, again, at the end of the day, there's a Black political imagination, but it has plenty of white allies that have historically always been there working in partnership to build a more equitable future. And that's a lesson that I think Central Florida and its past can share with us. And we'll talk a little bit about in chapter 2, dangers there, but I think we've run over time because they're supposed to be giving a giveaway and we were just chatting. So I'm gonna stop right there and give Gigi back the mic.
So I've lost my video. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys one more time now that I'm back on. Is everyone hearing my mic? If someone can just say yay or nay. Cannot hear my mic. Okay, so that's a technical issue because I did not turn my mic off. Can you hear me? You can hear me now? Let me know if you guys are hearing me. Okay, I think you can hear me now. Good. Okay, so what we were going to do is give away another drawing. It's going to be a question from the audience. So if you can't see me, it's because I'm scrolling through to find the question that someone just asked, and I'll bring that back to. I will bring that back to Julian and Scott to answer. So it was, when did Eatonville, the land in Eatonville, get sold? And let's see, when was land sold to form Eatonville? St. Lawrence AME Church was established in 1881. What land was the church established on? Was it unincorporated Maitland? And that question is from Angie Rentz. And so you, Angie, are going to receive a $50 Uber Eats card. So we're trying to make sure that you guys know this is an interactive event. And so if you are able to send us a question, you have a chance to win a prize. So Angie just won one. And I'm going to ask Julian and Scott to answer that question. And I think that the important thing is that local people and people across the US that are tuned in right now are trying to understand the Eatonville concept,
Yes, right.
the Hannibal Square concept. You know, how were we able to create those back in the day? And as you go through your discussion, I know it's going to be about how can we create those in today's day and time. So I'll start with that first question for either one of you that wants to answer that.
Well, I can answer for Eatonville that Lawrence reached out to his friend, another white northerner, Josiah Eaton, who was a year-round resident here, and arranged to purchase land. He subdivided it and made it available on easy terms. Those are Joe Clark's words, not Lawrence's. And the idea was that a respectable middle-class property-owning community would arise from this. And Eatonville began as a subdivision within Maitland. Much of the land was transferred from Lawrence to Joe Clark, and Joe Clark became sort of an intermediary. And Joe Clark became a kind of a realtor booster. And a lot of what you're reading is him saying, colored people of the United States, come to Eatonville, help solve the race problem. Just to explain how it went from subdivision to town, the African-American residents of this subdivision helped found the town of Maitland. They were about a third of the incorporators of the independent town of Maitland. And then a year later, they elected to become an independent incorporated township. There's a lot of sort of debate about whether they were whether they left of their own volition or whether they were pushed out. And we'll talk a bit now in a few minutes about Zora Neale Hurston, because she's one of the chroniclers of Eatonville's history, and she has a particular explanation for how that all came about. Should I answer the question about? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, in the case of Winter Park, of course, like Lawrence, Chase sold land to African Americans. Winter Park was a planned community. In the original plan, there are in fact references to Negro lots. These were smaller lots that he sold to African Americans who he intended to work in the luxury hotel that he was building. Part of the model for Winter Park was the creation of a luxury hotel called the Seminole Hotel, which was the largest hotel south of Jacksonville at one point in the 1880s, with a lot of amenities. And those African Americans who bought lot from Chase became part of Hannibal Square, and that was a bustling community that was very successful. And in fact, there had been an African American community there prior to that. But when Eatonville incorporates and Winter Park incorporates, they're technically, prior to incorporation, both are part of Maitland. And actually, the incorporation of both of these places removes a number of African-American voters that would have been voting in Maitland at the time. So, Scott, that question's all on you. Well,
it is, in effect, it is a kind of self-gentrification, a self-gerrymandering. The subdivision of Eatonville becomes an incorporated town, which means what they gain is self-governance. They gain independence. They gain autonomy, if not economic autonomy. Well, they have a measure of economic autonomy because they also own gardens and they're able to have subsistence farming, but they're also selling crops. It's more rural than Hannibal Square. So in Eatonville's case, when you see the stories about it, you see a sugar mill, you see agricultural enterprise. And Joe Clark talks a lot about how when work is good, we go out and do the work. We'll work for white people. When it's not good, we can live and survive and sustain ourselves. So there's a model of self-preservation in this.
Yeah,
and I should say that.
Go ahead.
Oh, just that in the codicils, the property could not be sold to anyone but colored people. And you could read that as, well, this is segregation, but it was also a form of to ensure white predators, predatory speculators, land speculators could not come in. And even Joe Clark wrote in the ads that the African Americans who purchased the property had to live there. So this was really built for people to live in. It was not supposed to be speculation, real estate speculation.
The thing I found out when I joined the board of Hannibal Square Community Land Trust was that the wrong sides of the tracks, Hannibal Square is separated, or the area in Winter Park is separated by that train track. And so the workers for the rich families that came to spend their summers in Florida lived on the Hannibal Square side of the train tracks, and then the white workers and the rich elite lived on the other side of the track. So that was one thing I found was interesting, because growing up in New York, we didn't really have that saying. It was more about, the train stations. No, I'm kidding. But no, I think that's a great segue into the chapter 2 for the post-war era. I know there's going to be a lot more questions that come in after that. And hopefully you guys will talk, about things like Gus Henderson. One of our questions from a group was about Gus Henderson, and what you're talking about that took place in Eatonville kind of is also related to like Black Wall Street. And, how do we create that kind of community today? So I know you're going to get into that later on in the conversation as well. But for now, we'll turn it back over to the two of you to talk about the post-war era.
So I think one of the things that we want to sort of acknowledge is that when we're sort of moving through these eras, we're hitting the high points, but we're not going to be able to get to everything. But I do want to say a little bit about Gus Henderson. Of course, he sort of emerged as an important figure in the African-American community in Hannibal Square. He's publishing the newspaper, the Winter Park Advocate, which at some level is the only newspaper at one point in the 1890s in Winter Park. He's a very strong Republican and very, very active in Republican politics. And so he will persist in the story of Winter Park until the politics, right? The politics do change for Winter Park and Hannibal Square. And so one of the things that we have to sort of take into account when we're talking about how does this collective vision evolve in the 20th century, well, while there is a good faith effort on the part of Black people and white people of the same political mind, basically Republicans, I always have to explain to the students, especially Black students, that yes, there were Black Republicans at one point that were cool. Not to say that if you're a Black Republican, you're not cool. But the nature of the politics, of course, changed a great deal. And part of that was, of course, with the end of Reconstruction and a really concentrated campaign for more than 20 years to strip African Americans of their political autonomy in the public sphere. And so this is the rise of Jim Crow segregation. So by the time we get to the end of the 1890s, African Americans are living in a Jim Crow world. For Winter Park, the reality of this sort of hostile politics is very detrimental for Hannibal Square because, of course, Hannibal Square is detached from Winter Park in the early 1890s and not reincorporated into the town boundary until the 1920s. And the reason for this is that the Democrats that were in control of the sort of political levers in the state capitol listened to Democrats in the city government who argued that the original town boundaries were drawn illegally. They were improperly drawn. You can find actually words from the mayor and the town council, Republicans, saying that this is all a lie. You can go into the archives and find editorials and letters to the editor and the advocate saying this is all about people trying to undermine African Americans, undermine the sort of like collective vision that we have here. But this is part and parcel of the sort of Southern Democrat transformation of the South in the late 19th century. And really, it's all part of what historians like to refer to as the nadir. So as we go into the 20th century, we're looking at the sort of failure of that collective vision, not because of a lack of activism or a lack of vision from African Americans, but because of violence from the part of white supremacists who use extra legal violence to suppress Black people, the lynching epidemic of the 1890s, and wanton destruction of Black property. So when we start talking about why African Americans were unable to maintain the integrity of this vision they articulated coming out of the Civil War is because of violence on the part of white people, massive property destruction designed to undermine their economic stability and economic progress, and a kind of acceptance of a imaginary story of the Civil War that we historians like to refer to as the lost cause, right? So this misremembering of both the cause of the war and the activism and ideological efforts associated with Reconstruction provide the cover for systematically excluding African Americans from the public sphere. And so that Jim Crow segregation that you gets Hannibal Square sort of isolated, sort of in an unincorporated Orange County for 20 years. But Eatonville, because it is its own municipality, it's one of several municipalities created in that sort of 1880s, 1890s period that do persist, right? We can think about some place like Mount Bayou or Prairie View, Texas, and things like that, cities like that persist. But many of the communities that are started in this period after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, are just settlements. They're just communities. They are not incorporated as municipal bodies, and so therefore they can't tax. They don't have sort of like legal standing to hold themselves together, elect their own officials, and do these things. But Eatonville does, and that is important because the ethos of Eatonville, as I say, sort of cut from the Booker T. Washington cloth, very much affects probably one of the most famous figures in terms of Eatonville as a place, and of course that's Zora Neale Hurston. And Scott, I think when we think about Zora Neale Hurston in the contemporary landscape, we think about her as this sort of iconoclast of the Harlem Renaissance. But she is I always think about her as an interdisciplinary scholar, a sort of proto-Afrofuturist, and a keen political and journalistic viewer who understands the nature of society, not just simply from the Black perspective, but from a broader perspective. And so the works that we know her for, of Mules and Men, Their Eyes Are Watching God, The Tracks on the Road, are very much tied to Eatonville. But there's so much more we can say about her as a figure. What would you say? Well,
I want to highlight the importance here of first the written word and then the spoken word. For us as scholars, we have a remarkable collection of first-person narratives of this period. We have the Eatonville Speaker, the only surviving issue of the Eatonville Speaker, a Black-owned newspaper, Black-edited. We have the Winter Park Advocate, edited by Gus Henderson, African-American resident of a predominantly white community, editing the newspaper and representing Hannibal Square and the Black community within that newspaper. And then we have Booker T. Washington extolling the virtues and the success of Eatonville. And then perhaps most importantly, we have Zora Neale Hurston, who was born there, or was not born there, moved there at a young age, lived there during her formative years, and constantly returned to Eatonville through her writings. But I also want to say that she didn't just write about Eatonville, she recorded the stories of the people who lived in Eatonville. And the first picture you saw was her on a song and story collecting trip through Florida in 1835. And so not only
1935.
What was that? 1930. I just say 1835. Oh my. Okay. So I think what I really do want to turn this back to you, Julian, because I think you'd like to talk about Zora and her political imagination. But I thought it might be useful to say that so much of what we're doing is based on the writings and oral traditions of Black people.
Right, and Zora Neale Hurston is a pivotal figure. Of course, the annual festival in Eatonville, the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of Arts and Humanities, sort of celebrates her and her emergence in the late 70s as a sort of figure that's rediscovered by the sort of writing imagination, and her sort of being added to the canon all of this is an important part. But when we think about the post-war era, Hurston is a figure that's worth noting, as I say, because of her writing in terms of the sort of political viewpoint that she brings to, and the strand of belief that she sort of brings to both the Harlem Renaissance and then that post-Renaissance period. And I think it's important to think about Hurston as the sort of critical Southerner coming to New York and critiquing some of the efforts on the part of sort of like the new Negro to sort of normalize Blackness, because she rejects this sort of proposition that Blackness isn't right? There's nothing wrong with Blackness, right? So there's a rightness to being Black, just like there's a rightness to being, French, right? Like there's nothing wrong with Blackness, and that's a counter narrative to the dominant racist narrative that's sort of articulated as an important part of white supremacy. And in Hurston's work, she's celebrating Eatonville and celebrating some of these ideas of it as an autonomous space, but she's also in her story thought of as this sort of Black conservative who comes out against desegregation, and comes out against the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And it's important to think about Hurston's sort of art as one that takes into account how Black people in Eatonville, and really Black people in Central Florida, who are very industrious, right? It's important for us to recognize that Black people in Hannibal Square own property in Eatonville, Black people in Eatonville own property in Hannibal Square. There's a broader Black social world that incorporates, people moving over and being in Paramore. These are people who own property, sometimes from the moment, families that own property, sometimes from the moment they got it in the 1890s, well into the early 2000s, and really late 2000s. We did a project in a class, and we saw families owning property in Hannibal Square from like 1892 to 2013, right? It's always in the same family. So there's an autonomy, there's a sort of property citizenship that's very important to these people. And the notion that Zora Hurston is really tapping into when she's responding to desegregation is a notion that she always articulates. There's nothing wrong with being Black. And she's fearful of losing Black spaces, which is an idea that I think an older generation of African Americans often articulate when they talk about segregation. And seemingly I think we're misinterpreting what they're saying. It's not advocating for segregation, as much as they're advocating for maintaining of that integrity around the sort of Black political imagination, sort of Black social political imagination that's so important. And so Hurston is a good way to sort of think about how those ideas sort of play themselves out. And Eatonville becomes, at some level, because it remains an autonomous place, a bastion for African Americans in the early 20th century, as the troubles and the struggles around segregation and civil rights continue, right? And this image showing the Hungerford campus from 1945 shows you that the Hungerford School, which was founded by graduates of the Tuskegee University, which had a Booker T. Washington Hall, right? It remains a kind of destination for African Americans in the early part of the 20th century. This is a place where African Americans could go to pursue their education. And this is a place that provided a kind of support for its residents. It maintained a kind of autonomy and strength throughout this period of Jim Crow segregation. And I think it's important for us to recognize that the ideas represented by a place like Eatonville and the spaces and institutions articulated by people at the very founding of some of these communities do persist. They persist in the people, and they persist in the institutions that we can see remnants of even till today. And I think the goals here when we talk about the post-war period is that African Americans are continuing to strive. When we talk about the collectivism, what are they trying to do? In the post-war period, of course, we know that African Americans didn't necessarily get all the access associated with some of the government support that comes out of the post-war period, World War II, in terms of the GI Bill. One place that they do try to capitalize on that is in Hannibal Square. So you have things like Carvertown, this community that is a planned community for African-American veterans. It's one of few such communities that African-Americans have access to because, of course, very famously, under the sort of resegregation in the post-World War II period, banks do not want to give loans to African-Americans, and they're shut out of the housing market. Again, adding to the sort of compounding series of institutional actions that prevent African-Americans from achieving economic success, right? Like home ownership is the #1 vehicle for most Americans in terms of building familial wealth. And so not being able to be in that market is detrimental. But in Hannibal Square, you have communities like Carvertown, and you have other veterans type themed communities like Magnolia Gardens. And these are two examples of that same, as I say, that same identity, the same striving on the part of African Americans that we can tie back to the 19th century, persisting into the contemporary period. Scott, what would you like to say about this moment?
I think you've said everything that I would mention, and yeah, I think one of the things that we're interested in is bringing this into the history of Winter Park, because there's a lot of focus on the founding era, and the story of these middle-class neighborhoods, white and black, middle and working class neighborhoods, have not been written into the narrative of Winter Park. And you and I have really tried to help provide the kind of material that will make that possible. And this is one of the products of our research.
Right. And in a similar way, the narratives of community in this sort of post-war period that we know point to how the difficulties for African Americans, Eatonville remains one of these places that has these other narratives. And Scott found, in his research, found this great advertisement of the Bellamy's of Eatonville. And I think this in some ways, again, speaks to how Eatonville sort of had a public narrative about it being a sort of solution for African Americans. That narrative is going to African Americans, but it's also going to white people. But as we go further and further into the sort of midpoint of the 20th century, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, I think that narrative becomes increasingly Eatonville as refuge, Eatonville as haven, Eatonville as a place of safety and security, as segregation does its work on the Black community. And these images were actually produced in relation to I think it's a car company commercial, right?
Yes, it's I think it's Ford. They were interested in the picture you'll see of the sugar mill, where they hooked I think it was a Ford truck that they used, and they just set it to run. Yeah, there it is. And so Ford thought this was just a great story, and did an amazing photo feature and a story on the family, the Bellamy family. Just a really wonderful snapshot of life in that moment, because we don't have as much documentation of this period as we'd like. We have oral history, which has been wonderful. We don't have a lot of visual history.
Right. And even for Hannibal Square, this period is very complicated, in part because as we go into this sort of post-war period, one of the things that sort of define this period is urban renewal. In the case of Orlando, both I-4 and 408 offer the opportunity to fundamentally transform the post-war landscape in Central Florida. In the case of Winter Park, they actually fought successfully to change the path of I-4. And they brought in a world-renowned planner, Maurice Rodoval, who came up with a city plan. But tellingly, in that plan, one of the things he proposes was to actually level all of Hannibal Square and get rid of it. And that idea wasn't actually pursued, but some of the elements in terms of like a street plan and arterial access through the west side was pursued. But the idea that the city would, in some level, entertain the thought of like leveling all of Hannibal Square remains one of the narratives that people remember when they think about how the planning process, and they have suspicion of the planning process, plays itself out. And I always think about this when we think about the sort of oral narratives that we've been collecting in Central Florida, because this story that the city thought about destroying Hannibal Square is really rooted in that sort of planning narrative that's all very familiar to urban historians of the post-war period when you think about urban renewal. But it was very literal. Like they came up with a plan that envisioned the complete sort of erasure, because those homes were quote unquote blighted. And that idea that the Black spaces don't have the same value and worth of white spaces, of course, is detrimental ultimately to both Black and white people. But that sets us up to sort of think about the last part of our chapter, and we'll come back. But I think once again we have to do a giveaway.
Can't hear you.
Oh.
Okay, I'll do it again. The unmute button keeps getting me. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Scott. I know that a lot of questions have been asked from that particular segment, chapter 2. And so we're going to give away another prize right now for one of those questions. And it's, again, thank you to our sponsor from City National, Michelle Edwards-Coley. She's the Vice President and Community Development Manager, and Ramon Please is a Community Development Banker. So we want to say thank you to them while we give out this air fryer, which is going to go to Jessica Hasera. And her question is, Dr. French talks about the political. How did the representation of Southern states change in Congress after slaves were freed? So Scott, if we can bring you back in to answer that, that'd be great.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I can't see myself on the screen, but well, I think that we.
There you go.
Okay. Well, we know that the Southern states benefited under slavery by the 3/5 rule, which gave them, for purposes of representation, 3/5 of a vote for every enslaved person. After slavery, first of all, emancipation did not confer citizenship. And so we know that the Reconstruction era results in citizenship for African Americans, that was a great fight. And then, of course, the struggle becomes how to keep that right to vote, and the efforts of whites to suppress the Black vote. It doesn't happen all at once and all in the same way. In places like Virginia, there were some really amazing cross-racial alliances around, like the farmers, what is the name of the Readjuster movement in Virginia is a Black-white alliance that leads to control of state government, and Black votes matter all through the late 19th century. But at the turn of the century, there's a much more concerted effort to suppress the Black vote, and states adopt a whole series of measures to ensure that Black people would not have an influence, the influence that they had on governance. Their role in self-governance is effectively removed.
So someone posed that question in the chat box. Was it that white people were threatened by a city like Eatonville or like Black Wall Street or even Ocoee in Florida? You know, where you had a community of prosperous Black people that was burned down and people murdered just because the people in that area were threatened by Black success.
Well, I would say go ahead.
I think that the literature here and research is pretty clear. Most of the violence that we see leveled at African American communities tend to be economically and politically motivated. Yes, there's a myth of like raping white women, but the net result of this is often economically prosperous or autonomous communities that don't necessarily need white people are the targets of violence, right? So Black Wall Street is an economic center. Ocoee was a sort of a thriving Black community. This was an important part of white supremacy. And I often like to point out that when we start talking about property, the nature of property is racialized here and has nothing to do with its intrinsic value. Like, you know how paper money doesn't mean anything unless, you know, it's backed by the government. It's just paper. It's the reason you think of it as money is because someone told you it's money. And land is sort of like that too, in a kind of sort of weird way. Black people in Florida, Black people in Eatonville and Hannibal Square have owned property forever. I mean, literally since the places were founded, but their property can never have the same value as white people's property because they own it, right? Like what makes, what suppresses its value is racism at some very basic level. And so gentrification, you can think about gentrification as a mechanism by which property that is quote unquote unused. Like there's a number of ways that we can think about gentrification as a kind of mythology in its own right. There's an economic element to it, but there's a reality around a kind of systemic suppression of Black wealth, even when it comes to them owning property. And so economic competition is an important part of why Black people face violence. Scott.
Yeah, I'll just say that if the Eatonville becoming independent in effect neutralizes it politically, in the eyes of whites, and then Hannibal Square gets gerrymandered out and it becomes neutralized politically. Hannibal Square is brought back in when it's useful to be brought back in. When Winter Park wants to become a city, African Americans by then have been disfranchised or largely disfranchised, and so they're not a threat to the political power structure.
So I'm guessing that this dialogue has taken us into chapter 3, the contemporary era.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Should I turn it over to you two for that?
Sure.
Sure.
Deal.
So she's very smooth. What's the legacy of this collectivism today? Of course, when we think about spaces like Hannibal Square, in my case, for Eatonville, or Paramore, we're really dealing with a kind of question of recovery and discovery at some level. What of this sort of Black past, this sort of African-American political imagination can we recover in the record? For Scott and myself, this has been very much something that we think of as a sort of digital humanities projects and digital humanities work, going into the archive, finding things like the Winter Park Advocate, which was supposedly gone, but was sort of like chunked up, and trying to bring it together in one place digitally to show you how that kind of political space and political imagination of African Americans played itself out. Like everything from just talking about parties and things like that in literary societies to actually fighting against gerrymandering and fighting against the grandfather clause or poll taxes and things like this, right? One of the things about segregation is that it was always an ongoing process, right? Like poll taxes did not really affect a lot of people in Hannibal Square. You can see in the newspaper, they just said they all had jobs and money. They just paid the tax and voted anyway. That's why they needed to be detached, right? But the history in a contemporary period, we're really sort of struggling around remembering this history, I would argue. And when we think about a place like Eatonville, it sits as a part of, for instance, and Winter Park, they're a part of the Florida Black Heritage Trail. And it's easy for us, I think, at some level to sort of project back a story. At some level, I think it's also easy for us to reclaim some of these Black figures, like a Gus Henderson, as a leader, as a businessman, as someone who was a strong community advocate, and see them in a positive light. But at the same time, when we look at these contemporary spaces, when we look at a place like Hannibal Square today, this is the spot where from the air, you see there's a marker down there that says Hannibal Square, and it talks about the sort of like Negro lots. And the Hannibal Square Heritage Center is down there from this aerial shot. But the fundamental historic core of that historic Black community is really sort of slowly but surely being transformed. And it really falls to the residents, the Black residents, and the white residents to sort of preserve it, right? To celebrate it, to use what is, I think, a really dynamic history of cooperation and envisioning for a kind of positive future, to make that a part of the Winter Park narrative. And I think there's nothing about the contemporary narrative about Winter Park that is slighted in any way by embracing this recognition of this more complicated, more holistic, more equitable vision that was at the core of its founding. And I think that's one of the things that continues to inspire organizations like the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust, right? That it's making available the dream of Winter Park to a new generation of people in a context where increasingly Central Florida is a very expensive place to live. And in the Eatonville case, Scott, what would you say about Eatonville in this sort of contemporary moment?
Well, I would say that the fact that you see the sign celebrating the historic town of Eatonville is a product of the community mobilizing to save itself. The town of Eatonville faced several almost existential threats in the 1800s, 1970s, and 1980s. There was a threat of the widening of Kennedy Avenue, which would have completely changed the character of the historic core of Eatonville, and the town successfully, the people of Eatonville allied themselves with the people of Maitland to fight that, to successfully fight that, and they won. They fought against adult entertainment. They were targeted by adult entertainment enterprises, and they kept them out. They were targeted for waste facilities. There's a kind of environmental racism where they were being targeted, and the community said no. And a lot of the way they were able to do that was this intense connection to the history and the desire to maintain the character and the integrity of this historic Black township. They fought it and they kept it out. And what they did was they didn't just fight these battles one by one. They realized they had to organize and institutionalize this preservation ethos, and they created Preserve Eatonville Community, which just celebrated its 30th year. I think I have that right. They organized around the history of Eatonville. They hired Everett Fly, landscape architect, to help write a historic resource, to write it as a landmark, to get its status as a historic landmark, and to invest in heritage tourism. And of course, they had something more than just the story of the founding of Eatonville, this remarkable history of an early incorporated Black township. They had Zora Neale Hurston, and Zora's rediscovery by Alice Walker and others dovetailed with the town's efforts to sort of protect its history and its special character. And the festival, the annual festival, the Zora Neale Hurston Festival, is a product of that.
So when we think about Juneteenth in the context of these two communities, the Central Florida community, I think ultimately one of the things that comes through is the importance of citizenship and sort of working in a collective way. And that idea of celebrating access to the public sphere, supporting community, and promoting the kind of health and safety represented by the sort of visions for community at the core of both Eatonville and Winter Park, I think are important lessons. And I do think that we have to continue to think through what those lessons are telling us in terms of like when we think about policy today. So that collectivism can be achieved through things like a land trust, It can be achieved by holding, I think, our public officials accountable to these sort of visions of community and equity and justice that I think ultimately are defining for the story we want to tell of Central Florida. And if we think about Juneteenth as an example of a kind of political imagination, I would say that we can think about some of the spaces in Central Florida is also an example of that political imagination. It's important to remember that legacy is something that it falls on the current generation to maintain and learn about and transmit to the next generation. So I think I'll end my comments there, and happy Juneteenth.
And with that, I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Alzo Reddick, who is on the line with us tonight. He, as the first African-American to serve in the House of Representatives since Reconstruction, he was instrumental in getting the state of Florida to recognize Juneteenth as a state-observed holiday back in 1991. And we're eternally grateful to him and grateful to have him with us here tonight.
All right. We said this would be an hour, and we went a little over, but we still delivered.
We did go a little over, but it's important historical data to share. I think it gives our viewers and our audience and our community that are tuning in some great perspective on what come through, the things that have been survived. And I want you to, with the questions that we're going to be asking you, really talk a little bit more about like creating place today. And do you feel that it's possible for us to rebuild communities like there were in Eatonville, like there is Black Wall Street? Today is Juneteenth, and it's probably 2020 is probably the first year that so many organizations have participated in Juneteenth events and recognizing it. And there's still a push to make it a national holiday. And with all of the abuse that's taking place right now, it's not as Black people don't feel safe today, unfortunately. And so I think the conversation and the history that you're sharing with us will help to guide people and to motivate them more. So one of the things that was going on for Juneteenth today was support Black businesses. So we're going to pick up some dinner from Oli's when this is over. And I know a lot of people that have been supporting Black businesses. It's about trying to keep the Black business, the Black dollar in the Black community for longer, because it doesn't stay in our community as long as it should, which is how we're not able to have more Black entrepreneurs and successful companies. But even if you look here in Orlando, Eatonville, Hannibal Square, the West Lakes Partnership area, where the Black professionals didn't have a place for their children to go to school or go to when the parents were going to work, so they built a daycare center. They couldn't go to the white bank, so they built a bank. They had their own bowling alley because they couldn't go to the white bowling alleys. What are you seeing in today's day and age in how we can create a place? And I'd like both of you to try to answer that question. What strategies, what do you think we have to do as a nation to come together and be stronger?
Well, I do think collectivism and collectives remain an important sort of like legacy of African Americans. Collective in the sense of coming together in, benevolent societies. African Americans were operating in a kind of political vacuum and socially defined through violence, physical spaces, right? And so, the barriers to allowing Black money and Black bodies to leave Black spaces were very, very, very paramount. Today, we don't have those same barriers, but the collectivism that was forced upon us is not necessarily collectivism that we can't pursue through our own sort of actions, right? So I think of the land trust as a tool to allow low income people who don't necessarily have to be Black, but clearly because it's operating in historic Black space, many of them are going to be Black, and other bodies like that are viable. We don't think enough about working collectively, I think, and now those collectives don't necessarily have to be about they can be more innovative, right? Like I think about some of the spaces like maker spaces, and some of the activism around Afrofuturism, and how some of these maker spaces are being pitched to Black people as a way to like realize sort of Afrofuturist ideas, but collective that teach people coding. At some level, coding is the factory job of the 21st century, and it's meaningful. I think that in Eatonville, the PC has an after-school clinic where they have computers where kids can learn about computers, right? Those kinds of activities that give kids skills early, collective that think about pooling money for investment or savings. And again, we live in the 21st century, and you think about investing purely as a local enterprise, but you know, you should think about yourself as a global actor, because African Americans have always been interested in diaspora. They've always been interested in Africa. And the money that you're saving in a savings account, are you investing in an international account? Are you thinking about opportunities? I mean, I know that may seem strange, but at some level, you have to have the imagination to think about what a future holds for you as an individual, your family. How are you sort of collecting your wealth and maintaining your wealth and planning in a way that will be successful? So I'm not an economist by training. I think that history here is pretty clear. This is things that Black people did in the past. In some ways, these are things that you still see Black people doing. There are investment clubs that people talk about. Those techniques do work.
Agreed. How about you, Scott?
Well, I can't really address it quite on that same level. I think of Eatonville, and right now it's in the midst of, it's at a really an interesting moment when the Hungerford property is being developed, and there are plans being considered or about to be considered. And Preserve Eatonville Community, PEC, is taking an active role in that and is working with the group to sort of imagine the future. And in those conversations, this is where Julian began talking about placemaking in the way he just did about maker spaces. And my mind goes to connecting modern placemaking and modern activities to the past. The history runs through all of it, that the Eatonville Yards and Gardens Club, which is still quite active in growing food and organic food and ensuring that the knowledge that goes into that is passed along, and the culture around food and cooking and growing is passed along, that gets preserved in some way. And I don't just mean in a library, but it gets built into whatever redevelopment happens. If there are going to be farm-to-table restaurants in Eatonville, in the newly developed Hungerford area, they ought to be working with local growers, and that ought to be stipulated. And the education ought to be built in around that.
Right. There are certain policy things like community development agreements, right? Like you can get together as citizens and go, like, we don't want developments that happen here unless they hit these markers. Voting is important. Like, I don't know any other way to say it. If you think about the politics, if you don't like the politics that you're currently living through, did you vote? Because that's a thing. It's still a thing. So that's important. I can't stress that enough. Previous generation of African Americans were pretty clear on voting. Like, you have to do it. So I would say, think about that. Think about what are the sort of cornerstone tools of being a citizen. For African Americans coming out of the Civil War, they were pretty clear on what those things were. You need to have the vote. You needed an education. You needed to work diligently, often sometimes with very menial jobs, but saving was very important. It's really amazing when you look at the record how many people who own a lot of property in a place like Winter Park who were Black, and their job was, in the census record, laborer. They just saved their pennies, right? So those are, they're not sexy and they don't involve like really elaborate things, but you know, fundamentals are important even today, right? Save 10% of your paycheck. Doesn't matter how much you. I had a relative once said that to me. It doesn't matter how much you make, just save 10%. You'll make more money later. You know, I was a kid at the time, so I was like, "What?" Like, so, yeah. Funny aside, but I was like, like save 10%, right? So you know, those are. I sound like a really old man, but those are really simple things, and like they're hard to refute in the grand scheme of things. You can build bigger things by working collectively, but individual actions, I think, also remain very important.
And I'll just add the voting is using your voice. So it's using your voice to take action to make sure that things change. And we have to get more people of color to vote the, I think it's called the 4 quadrants. So instead of just coming out for the election of the presidency, you know, you need to be there voting for your local congresspeople, for your local representatives, for your local judge, to make sure that you have a voice in the decisions that are being made. Or the county officials, all of it. You have to vote every single time there's an opportunity for you to weigh your opinion in how you want to see your area or your country run. So I agree with that 100%, and also filling out the census, which is still taking place right now. So if anyone watching hasn't done their census, please do it, because that is a big determination of finances, of funding going into different communities and different areas. So we definitely need more people to do that as well. I'm going to say that we are ending the program. Don't get confused by the question on the screen. We are ending the official program because we told people that we would try to keep it within an hour. So if anyone has to jump off, we totally understand. And we thank you guys for listening. We ask you to connect with the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust. We are going to continue with some of the Q&A, but we want you to go to our website, hannibalsquareclt.org. It's on the bottom of the screen, and fill out the Google form. Let us know if you're interested in volunteering with us. Let us know if you're interested in partnering with us. Let us know if you want to sponsor one of our events, because we are in the business of creating permanent affordable housing, and that is something that we truly need in our area and across the U.S. So we're grateful to you guys for participating in this conversation tonight. And if it's okay with you, we'll take a few questions from the community that has been listening and really engaging in the chats online. People have been answering other people's questions. So thank you, Kim, for answering some of the questions out there that were being asked and making sure that the education knowledge is being shared and spread throughout the entire conversation that we're having right now today. But we are going to do the last drawing. Prize is going to go to Nathan Selikoff for his question, and he is going to receive a Kindle. So we thank you again, City National, Michelle Colley, and Ramon, please, our partners at City National. Nathan is just winning Kindle for participating in tonight's program. The question was, were white folks in Central Florida threatened by the success of Eatonville, thinking of Tulsa, and how much of the alley ship was a marriage of convenience versus true equity? So I think you had touched upon it before, but definitely something that's important to reiterate as we have communities that are trying to collaborate more and do the collectivism that you were speaking about.
Yeah, I think that both Scott and I can point to ways where white people were frightened of Eatonville, right? But and I think it goes to the second part of the question: how much of this was a marriage of convenience versus true equality? I do think that that the nature of that, the fighting was economic competition, and Scott's done some great work, sort of documenting how white people in Florida were wanted to keep as much land as they could out of the hands of black people. Because of orange culture, right? Because they wanted the land for their own agribusiness. I think, like in terms of this question of convenience versus true equality, that's a complicated question. I think in the case of Lauren Chase and Gus Henderson, that it's a little of both. I'm going to be honest with you. I think that Lauren Chase and Gus Henderson had a working partnership that was ideological. They were both Republicans. But I do think that Lawrence Chase was consistent in narrativizing, both in very public ways, but also seemingly in very private ways, his belief in partnership with Black people, right? So like he believes in the idea that Black people can be a part of the community. And Eatonville, I think, is also super complicated, but you know, that's on Scott.
Well, I think in Eatonville's case, you had a kind of protective white patronage, influential, very wealthy, influential white patron in Lewis Lawrence, Josiah Eaton, for whom the town was named. The streets are named for the white patrons. St. Lawrence Church is named for Lawrence. There's a very public sort of acknowledgement of those patrons. The also interesting thing is all of the properties around Eatonville are owned by Northern whites, wealthy Northern whites. And so it's got a kind of protective ring around it. And I guess the question is, how threatening would their economic success be? I don't think it was, at least, I think it was more of the political threat. The economic part of it, I don't think was really all that threatening. They were part of the political economy of the area. Eatonville was woven into it the same way Hannibal Square was. They were very important to the labor. They were an important labor source. And I don't think that they were making so much money that they were a threat to the powers that be. Now, they may have been a threat to those of lesser means, but the elite classes, I don't think, saw them as a threat. And I'll say one other thing is that they were advertised to the world as respectable, and there were codicils in the deeds that said no gambling, no prostitution, none of this. And that was more, it was less about controlling the behavior than about signaling to the white people that this was not going to be corrupt, or, you know, it wasn't going to be like they often would compare it to the black bottoms found in other cities, the settlements that just sort of spring up haphazardly. This was a planned community, and morality was baked into it. Middle-class morality was baked into it. And anyone who bought into these communities had to meet a kind of standard. They had to improve in Hannibal Square. They had to improve their property, right? Within like 2 years or...
Right, yeah. They had to build a home.
They had to build a home.
Within 2 years. You know, I think that's really interesting to point that out, because it is very much a counter narrative, right? Like it's these white people working with Black people to create a different narrative to the story that's being concocted by white Democrats, like about Black people, right? Like, and one great story that you can read in the record is that, you know, there's an interview with Eatonville resident, and said Eatonville is the answer to this talk that Black people can't do anything. Like that's his, you know, sort of like why Eatonville? He's like, Eatonville's the answer to this basically white talk that Black people can't do anything, white Democratic talk that Black people can't do anything. And so it's a very, very, very clear counter public space, right? Like it is designed to be a thing that will prove to white residents, often white residents who are not in the South, as you're alluding to, right? It's a lot of people in the North who want to believe that Black people can be successful, but you know, increasingly don't have the political will to ensure it through policy, right? Yeah. And this is one of the reasons I think that Booker T. Washington is successful in pulling white donors, because he's able to articulate this message of like, you can give your money to me, and I can make some of these things that you're envisioning and hoping for happen. And so it's a question of the stories you want to tell about the past at some level, both in at that moment, you know, the 1900 or 1920 or 1940 or 1960, and even today, right? Like, what story do we want to tell? Do we want to tell this story of this collectivism and the activism that it represented, or do we want to tell a different story? And I think that's really interesting thing to think about. So we've drawn on and on, Scott. So I think we probably have to walk away. Otherwise,
I think we should
just like let it draw on.
We'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah,
you know,
we'll get back around to it. What?
We had a couple more questions for you guys. They're enjoying what you're saying, so if it's okay with you.
All right,
we'll ask a couple of more. Okay, so I believe Kent is going to put one up on the screen. Two more. From Kim Mold, can single voting districts for city commissioners in Winter Park help preserve the Hannibal Square community and provide a stronger voice for the West Side residents?
Yep.
So for Jillian, could you just share with people why single voting districts was necessary?
Right. So as I alluded to, in the founding of Winter Park, you had the residents of the West Side basically voting in support, led by Gus Henderson, of incorporation. Right. Without their support, Winter Park would not have been incorporated as a town. As a result, there were 2 aldermen on the city government. When the town was, when Hannibal Square was detached, that is, that the Democrats in the city made this argument that, Hannibal Square wasn't included in the town the right way. All the Black residents basically are separated out and then they're not part of the city until 1923 when the town of Winter Park wants to become the city of Winter Park. When they get incorporated back in, they're not incorporated in single districts. It's at large voting, right? Like there's not been a Black elected official from in Winter Park since the 1890s, right? But if you were to divide, granted, again, even this has its complications, but district voting would most likely get you a Black representative from a primarily Black part of town, right? And then that person would be able to articulate policies. Again, having a Black representative in itself isn't going to save anything. But one of the things that it would do, I think, is that it would probably activate a greater sense of trust in the part of residents, Black residents, in process, right? Because they would have someone that they knew as capable of sort of representing their interests, right? So there's a deep distrust in the municipal process, in part because, yes, there's a long history of their Black political vote being diluted, their representatives not, their wishes in terms of like policy and practice not necessarily being reflected in the city government. And so, this is the reason why I think a lot of people have talked about, changing the voting to sort of single districts that, you have these representatives in each district. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing, but you can still have at-large seats, but that would change the dynamic, obviously. The other thing, of course, is, I say, getting more votes out, because even without single districts, if I think if African Americans in Winter Park are more organized, they could probably influence the outcome of elections in more deliberate ways if they sort of thought about it. But that all becomes a question of like electoral politics and numbers. And again, I think there's plenty of people who are really sort of steeped in the politics of Florida that can sort of tell you about the complexities around that, because clearly gerrymandering is a thing. But at the same time, there is opportunity at the local level for people to be active. And I think that's one of the things about activism right now that's really interesting. It's very grassroots. It's very much people all across the country being very active. And there's no person in charge. They all just know what the problem is and they're acting on it.
Agreed. That kind of brought me to the question from Glenn Anthony, and I don't think Kent has that on his screen, but what he was saying is he thinks the biggest challenge with voting is the stigma conspiracy theory mindset that the votes do not count. how do we combat this? I know a lot of people thought that a lot of Democrats thought that Hillary had the win 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and so they didn't go out and vote because they just knew that Donald Trump wasn't going to be president, so they just didn't vote. And then we had to actually say, this is why he got in, is because you didn't go out and vote. So there's definitely that thought, that mindset out there. And we know, like in the state of Georgia, with all of the rigging, the voting issues that they're having, how do you see us being able to have an impact with our vote and to actually sway the political landscape so that politicians aren't just coming to the Black community when it's time to vote, but that they are there supporting the Black community, throughout their period of office or before they get there?
Yeah. Scott, you want to take that?
I don't think
I don't think that. I think the historical answer, there is I think a historical perspective that's helpful here, right? In the sense that in the past, block voting, or that is a group sort of voting for a particular candidate, has been very pivotal. Even during segregation, at height of segregation, efforts by people like Harry T. Moore, who was the NAACP's representative in Florida, he advocated that Black people join the Democratic Party, right? Because it's one party voting, because he wanted Black people to be able to sort of like shift, right? So he wanted Black people to be like a kind of a counterweight, a weight that could shift the outcome. And the way that works is like you all have to like get behind a particular candidate, doesn't matter what color it is. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he has to have policies that you approve. And like, you can do that a number of different ways. It could be political clubs. It could be like, a club that has like a kind of like standardized nonpartisan agenda around community improvement, right? And like you bring it to a candidate and say, will you support this? Then we'll guarantee like this amount of votes, right? Like if they don't do it, the next election you elect them out, right? Like it's transactional, right? And also, of course, you can get involved in process, right? So more Black people should volunteer at polling places. More Black people should think about pooling their money. Again, it often comes down to like stories you want to tell. Like, as a historian, I often think about this. Like, well, Juneteenth is a holiday. When I was a kid, everybody knew what it was. I don't know any Black person doesn't know what Juneteenth is. Sorry, Scott, but I don't know any Black person. That's a joke.
But where did you grow up, Julian?
I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, right? But I think I come from Alabama. I don't know any Black person who doesn't know what Juneteenth is. They may not necessarily
I know a lot.
Know all the political. Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Especially people like
they did not know. Oh, okay, that might be the case. Maybe this is a southern thing, but I don't know that all people know the political elements of it, right? Like they may not see it the way I might see it now. Even as a kid, I didn't necessarily know the politics of it. I just knew it was
right.
I do think that there's a question here about being involved in the process, right? Like if you give up on the process, that's kind of the goal of people, of some people. Like they want people to be disinvested. If you think about some of the things that we learned from the 2016, it's really classic negative inference voting tactics. Like they're trying to make people angry so they get so frustrated so they don't think about the process, right? And so like, just thinking about the process, like registering people to vote, working at the polling places, going through the process of the polling place in your neighborhood. Because you can get a polling place in your neighborhood. It's a process though, but you can get it done. So when, there's just these things, voter suppression, making it harder to vote, let's not call it voter suppression because that'll anger someone, but making it harder to vote is about allowing a small percentage of people who are very ardent about something to dictate things. And that's why, as you alluded to earlier, presidential politics tend to bring out more people, right? And so it has a bigger impact. But it's the little elections that matter.
Agreed.
It's like building a house. If you just started at the top floor, won't happen. You kind of have to have a basement, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that there are organizations and nonprofits that are very adamant, very clear about providing voters with information about people and policies. There are ways that you can volunteer. Even if you don't necessarily believe in a particular candidate, being a part of the process in terms of the party can help you dictate the policy platform, right? And at some level, that really matters, right? Like you might not necessarily like the person running at the top of the ticket, but if the policy platform delivers in meaningful ways in terms of like your long-term health and safety,
right.
I can't, if you don't want to vote for that person, I don't know what to tell you. Like again, I'm not on political side. I mean, I think there's just we can sort of step back and sort of think about this. And if you think about it from the other side, like there are so many people who are one issue voters who vote quote unquote conservative, like, and we all know the issues that they vote about. But if you ask them about something other than that, they're super like, I don't care, right? But that one thing will get them to go to the post office, right? It'll get them to go to the poll. So
I think that works. Those are great answers. Scott, I guess we can do like parting words from both of you guys and how to end today's conversation. Scott, do you want to start?
Oh, just that, you know, the more I think about this goal of permanent quality, affordable housing, you know, it didn't, until I saw your website, I didn't realize just how much of what you're doing now resonates with what they were trying to do at the beginning in Eatonville. And, you know, it's still a goal. And I think I just want to applaud you for the creativity and ingenuity and the hard work. So many volunteer hours going into this. And I'm just so glad that everyone who's part of this event has learned about Hannibal Square Community Land Trust.
Agreed. Thank you, Scott. We've enjoyed having you as a part of this program.
Thank
How about you, Julian? Parting words?
Yeah, I agree with Scott. I think one of the things about the land trust is that it does do the hard work of trying to provide a vehicle for people to, as I say, tap into this longer legacy of Black people in the community, and Black and white people in the community in terms of like promoting community. I commend you for all the innovative work that you're doing in terms of like using the land trust model, which in itself has its roots in the civil rights movement, and using it to empower people and reach out. And I think ultimately, again, this is a collective action, right? It's a bunch of people volunteering around helping the community. So it's a model that can work. And for people watching, if you're sort of struggling about what to do in these times, you should think about something like the land trust is like a legitimate thing that you could do that can help.
Right, agreed. Well, thank you so much, Julian. Thanks again, Scott. We thank all of you guys for tuning in tonight for this conversation. We hope that you've enjoyed it and that you've learned some things you didn't know before. We definitely want you to go to our website, HannibalSquareCLT.org, and make sure that you connect with us. We definitely need different people to partner with. We need different companies to partner with us. We need donations to create more permanent affordable housing. And we want you to learn more about it. As a local realtor, I know that there is still a void of people understanding the benefits of a ground lease and purchasing a home through a land trust. But it is a nationwide initiative. It's one that's been here for over 20 years, and we are looking to expand so that we can fill the gap of affordable housing in Central Florida. So on behalf of Reynolds Lewis, our Kent Kernstein, who put on this wonderful event, the entire board, and our committee members, we thank you all, and we hope that we can connect with you in the future. Have a great night and happy Juneteenth.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.